Today we're going to be working on this metal material, which includes having the scratches on the metal. If you want the project file that we're going to be working on today to follow along with or to use for your own material, there will be a link down below in the description to my Patreon where you can download the finished project file where we have made this entire material from scratch on the default cube. So let's apply this material to the default cube, just to keep things simple. You can apply this to your own objects however you like. There's going to be 4 steps to this, that being the roughness map, the color map, the normal map, and then finally we're going to add the generation for the scratches on top of that, which will influence both the color and normal maps. Let's get started with the roughness map, because that is by far the quickest and easiest to do. So we're going to start by adding in a noise texture. And if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, which you should, pressing Ctrl-T to add some mapping nodes. Aside from the noise texture, we're also going to add a Musgrave texture, which we also hook up into the mapping nodes we just generated. Previewing the noise texture by holding Ctrl-Shift and clicking on it, we're going to increase the scale of this quite a bit to somewhere between 25 and 30. Then we preview the Musgrave texture, and we're going to increase that a bit as well, but not nearly as much. As you can see, this is a much more rough and coarse kind of noise. And we're going to increase that to somewhere between 8 and 10. Then, coming off the factor of both of these textures, we're going to run them through a color ramp. For the Musgrave texture, the bottom one, we're going to change the black color to being about 50 or so % gray. And you can play around with this white to make this more or less contrasty depending on what look you want. But I would really recommend only doing that once you have it plugged in to the roughness so you can see the actual output of it rather than doing it based on this. Then for the noise texture, we're going to keep the black at being black, but we're going to actually make the white a little lower, going down to about 75% white. So that'll look a little something like this. It's just a little less bright than fully white. Then we're going to combine these two. We do that with a multiply vector math node. Don't use the mixing node. In this case, we want to use the vector math multiply. Just hook them both up into the multiply. Doesn't matter which one goes where. And we'll see we now have this roughness map. And that just goes straight into the roughness pin here of your principled BSDF. Previewing that now, and putting the metallic all the way up to 1, because we're making a metallic surface here, we can see we have some reflectivity and we've got some less reflective spots. Now you can play around with these values around here to see how reflective things should be. So if that's a little too reflective for you, you can increase the black values to be a little lighter gray. I recommend you don't do that until we go through the normal maps though, because those also are going to make it less reflective. So let's add in a frame and drag these nodes into that frame so that we have this very well organized. Coming up here to the top right side, we can give it a label and we'll call this roughness. Next up, using the same texture coordinate node that we already have, we're going to come up with this and add a mapping node. That mapping node is going to go into a linear light mixing node, with the other pin being a noise texture, where the vector is also gotten from the generated. From that linear light, we're going to go into another noise texture here, and this way we can influence the vector and distort it a little bit with this noise texture. So if we preview this, we'll see that this noise texture is very distorted. And the amount of distortion is based on the factor of this linear light node. So we want to distort this just a little bit, not too much, just for it to look a little something like this. Then taking that factor output, we're going to put that into a mixing node, but not a normal mixing node. We're going to look for a mix color node, because we want this B color, the thing we're mixing with, to be slightly less than 1. So the default position here is about correct. Making sure that the top is set to color and the bottom here is set to mix. We can see this more or less just gives us a slider as to how much the noise exists. which is very useful because we're going to use this output and put it into a Voronoi texture into the vector. And here we can now see if we crank this all the way to 1, it's entirely blank. We don't want that. So we want it somewhere around the 70% mark. Then we can scale up or down our noise depending on what we want. And the same with our Voronoi itself to get a look that's a little something like this, and then maybe even increase the mix factor a little bit more. Now finally, the distance output from this can go into a color ramp, which then itself goes into the base color of the material. And here you can give it any amount of contrast that you want or any color that you want. So if you want something that's a little bit more like a blue type of metal, you just put this to dark blue and this to a very slightly lighter blue. And we can see we've got a more blue kind of steel. Adding another frame just for organization purposes and putting all of these into that frame and labeling this as color. We're actually going to use a lot of this color related stuff to generate the normals as well. So we're actually quite a way done with the material now already. Because let's put the output here to the side a little bit. If we take the roughness and pull off of that into a linear light mix node, we're going to actually mix that with our Voronoi texture output. This will, at a factor of 1, just show the Voronoi distorted output, and at a factor of 0, just our noise and Musgrave texture output. We're going to sit at about 0.1 or 0.2 on this scale. Then, coming all the way off one of these mapping nodes, I like to use the above one over here from the roughness. We add yet another noise texture. We're doing a lot of noise textures in this one. We're going to crank up the scale on this quite high. About 80 to 100 or so usually is what I go for. And the detail, we're going to crank that up quite a bit as well to 5 or 6 just to add in a little bit more detail and sharpness to it. Then the output of the linear light and this new noise texture are going to go through a soft light mixing node where the noise texture goes in the bottom, linear light goes up into the top, and we set the factor all the way up to 1. And if we then finally take that result and put it into a bump node, into the height input, we can use that as our normal map. And now if we look at the material itself, this is way too strong of an effect. So we're going to decrease the strength by quite a bit. But as you can see, it's already looking a lot less reflective. So now that we've got these normals in place, you can go back and try to figure out what this color ramp here for the roughness should actually look like. With a little messing about, we get something a little bit more like this, which looks as a pretty good start. And then finally, we only got these scratches left, which is actually a remarkably easy thing to do as well. So we're going to start by, instead of pulling off the generated, I'll just zoom in a little bit. We're going to start that off by coming back to our texture coordinates. And instead of using the generated like we've been doing so far, we're actually going to pull off the object. And we're going to put in a mapping node. That mapping node then goes into a noise texture, which then goes into a color ramp as you probably expected at this point. We'll set the scale for the X in the mapping node to somewhere between 6 and 10. So let's go with 7 to make this look a little bit more like scratches. You'll note that the sides here don't get scratched at all. That makes sense because it's not getting scaled in the X direction. Don't worry about that too much for the time being. Then we can scale the texture however we like. And then in the color ramp, we're going to put the black to the right side and the white to the left side. And we're going to put them quite a ways down here. That way, the entire noise texture gets distilled down to just a couple of simple lines going into this direction. Then we can copy this entire setup and get a, while holding shift and dragging right click, we can add a connecting node here and hook that up into our new mapping node. Here we're going to set the scale for the X back to 1 and we're going to set the scale for Z, so let's preview that real quick, to 7 instead. Now these scratches are going the other way. The output of those two color ramps are going to go into a adding node, a mix add node, and we're going to clamp the results of this. And when we set the factor to 1, we can see there's a proper mix of both direction of scratches now. And we could leave it at this. So if we just put this into another bump node, into the height, and we plug this normal output into the normal inputs of our other bump node, we'll be able to see that we already have our scratches. You can decrease the strength if they're a little too strong. And you can see that the blobs we have here are kind of like chips being removed from the material. So I personally quite like having those. And that only really happens when you have flat surfaces that exactly align with the X, Y, or Z axes. But as it stands, we literally only have scratches going into the left and right direction and the up and down direction. And if you've ever seen anything that looks scratched, scratches go in all sort of random directions. So we want some diagonal ones as well. And that we will do in a different way. So let's copy these two mapping nodes over again and do the same thing here. Make a new linking node by holding down Shift and dragging with right click. Makes things a little bit less messy to look at if we can just use this instead of having to go all the way back up here and dragging all the way back down every single time. And this time, instead of using a noise texture, we're going to use a Voronoi texture. And at this point, we're very familiar with it. We're going to take the distance from that and we're going to put that into a color ramp node, where we'll change the method here from being F1 to distance to edge. That generates this pattern. Also, the scale in your mapping node, we can set that back to 1. So now we have this pattern, which you've probably seen in a lot of other materials because it's a very useful noise pattern to have. And we'll just drag down this white until we've got very thin black lines. You can mess with the scale all you like. And we're going to copy this over and hook that up into the other mapping node. This one, however, we will set back to using F1 method. And we can see that this will, again, set the scale back to 1. We can create this circular pattern with this. If you've got tryptophobia, this is not very nice to look at. But then if we take both of these color ramp outputs and add them together with a mix add, putting the factor all the way up to 1 and clamping the results, we can now see we've got this interrupted Voronoi pattern, and we can pretty much control how much of these scratches we actually get to see with the bottom color ramp, and then we can control how thick those scratches are with the top color ramp. I like to copy this over and make another iteration of this, which again, make a new connection node. And we're just going to rotate this in the Y direction by like 45 degrees for both of the mapping nodes. So now if we compare the look of these two outputs, we've got this, and then we've got a rotated version of it. So that, again, it's all about generating some randomness here. These two we can add together with a mix darken node. Doesn't really matter which one goes into which input, because we'll put the factor all the way back up to 1. And now we've got a map that holds both of these. Okay, so the only issue now being is that this is a white map with black scratches, and the other map we just made is a black map with white scratches, and that's not going to mix together very well. So we're going to go through a inverting node with this one, and when we hook that up into the color here, we can see that that actually matches up much better. And now we can do the same thing we did before, and that is take out our noise texture scratches into a addition node, and then put our inverted Voronoi scratches into there as well. And now we'll be able to see a combined map with all these scratches going every which way and being entirely random. Of course, there's a lot of fine tuning to be done here. So something I like to do is adding a value node here and hooking the value up to all of the different scales of the textures for the different scratches. And now I can, with one slider, scale up and down all my scratches. So if I want a much more finely detailed scratch map, I can totally do that. And as a final little bit of detail, what I like to do is influence the color of the metal by the scratches as well. So we'll take this color ramp output that we've made near the beginning of the tutorial, and we'll put that into a mix color node into the A slots. And then we'll take this scratches map that we've made, this one, and we'll put that as the factor for this mixing node. And the output for that will go into the base color instead. And when we set this bottom option to being mix, we'll be able to see that this bottom field over here, the B field, will be representative of the color that the scratches themselves have. So being entirely black is a little too much, but a darker grayish blue, for instance, tends to work relatively well with this kind of thing. So after I've cleaned up this project file a little bit and made it a little bit more readable, it'll be available down below in the description via my Patreon if you want to download it and check it out for yourself, or just have this material to use in your own projects. And now that we have this material, we can add any mesh we want. So let's add a monkey, for instance, and add this material to it, and it should just work fine. As you can see, adding it on the monkey, it's instantly fine because it's entirely procedural. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see